It's a wild world out there, but some worlds are even wilder. Hi, my name is Tyler Hapney, and you're listening to Dungeons and Dystopias. Thank you for listening. Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of Dungeons and Dystopias. I am your game master and host, Tyler Hapney. I have run hundreds of sessions of Cyberpunk Red and Dungeons and Dragons, and this podcast is a way for me to reconcile my thoughts on both of those systems and some of the various lore and other things that happen within those universes. But today we're going to be talking a bit more about Dungeons and Dragons, but before we get to that, I would like to say I was right. Last week, I predicted that we would be getting. Well, I not predicted. I mean, I knew we'd been seeing sort of things about it, but I had predicted that by the next episode, the Cyberpunk Red single player mode DLC will have dropped, which means already we know what our next episode is going to be about here, and that is, of course, I'm going to be covering single player mode. But for today, we're going to be talking more about Dungeons and Dragons. I'm excited to get a little bit more into talking about some settings. I've talked a little bit about settings like the Dalelands and Waterdeep, and I know I even discussed Avernus a little bit, but I know last week I mentioned something that might be somewhat interesting to some people, the Spelljammer setting for D&D. And there's just a lot that goes into Spelljammer. There's no way I could cover it all in 20 minutes. I'm going to be giving an extremely basic overview of what Spelljammer is. We might not even be getting into some of the more obscure sort of concepts, I guess, from Spelljammer. I don't know how deep we're going to be getting into like phlogiston or however you pronounce it, and like color pools and stuff, but very interesting stuff to look into either way. But what is Spelljammer? Well, Spelljammer is basically space pirates for Dungeons and Dragons. It is the space setting, essentially. It's kind of sci-fi. It's pretty cool. But it is, above all else, it's like kind of like imagine Disney's Treasure Planet. Sort of kind of those types of vibes. If you've played Baldur's Gate 3, you literally start the game in a Spelljammer and in a ship that is designed for traversing through different planes through spelljamming. And that is, that's awesome because when you really look at Baldur's Gate 3, it has an insane amount of lore in it that actually comes from, Spelljammer and the astral plane and all that business. So I think it's really interesting, or would be interesting to take a look and kind of see, sort of what's going on with Spelljammer. What is exactly happening with this astral plane and all that business? Well, let's first sort of go into what a Spelljammer is. There's a lot that one could say a Spelljammer is, but the basic easy version is a Spelljammer is a ship that flies through space, through the astral plane, and the way it is propelled is by casting spells and magic into the Spelljammer helm. So typically, it's powered by thoughts and sort of function and power, and it's a very metaphorical kind of ride, if that makes sense. To me, spelljamming it's supposed to feel almost, I guess, abstract in the way that you kind of approach it. I mean, we can physically see, nautiloids and illithids and the way they pilot things, but I think for a real Spelljammer campaign, there should be this sort of whimsy, maybe a little bit of, strangeness in the air, things that you can't exactly explain, but that's just how the astral plane works. What is the astral plane? Well, the astral plane is, I don't want to exactly call it the plane between planes, but it's kind of the best way to describe it, or one of the best ways. It's basically space. It is this area between the planes where, there's really no oxygen, gravity's very low. There's, floating rocks and all sort of floating fish and all sorts of crazy stuff you can see in the astral plane. And, you can astral project and send your body straight to the astral plane if you're a high enough wizard or magic user. But the astral plane is really good for just getting around. That's kind of the best way to use it. And for spell jamming, obviously, that's kind of the whole spiel. So, we go into the astral plane from wherever. Typically, you're going to be starting out in a place called Wild Space. Wild Space this is mostly, I'm going to be using 5e lore on this. I know. Crazy to imagine all the simplified 5e Spelljammer lore here, but basically we have these crystal spheres that contain something called Wild Space. Wild Space is a sort of localized sort of space around what would be a material plane planet like Toril or I don't Greyhawk Earth. You get the idea. It'd basically just be that solar system, and then once you get past that point, you break out of the crystal sphere, which contains everything, and make your way out into the astral plane. And from there, I know I mentioned color pools earlier, and I'm not going to go too much into them, but basically, you can get to the different planes through a variety of different ways, one of them being strangely colored pools of color out in the middle of the astral plane. You enter them, and congratulations, you've entered into a different plane, perhaps even different wild space. All that crazy business. There's just a lot to Spelljammer, and it was crazy to me how much 5e kind of we had a lot of Spelljammer stuff in 5e. I mean, I kind of exaggerating when I said a lot, but we had mentions of Spelljammer in 5e way before we even had a book or a setting or anything that sort of defined the new lore going forward for 5e Spelljammer. And I'm talking about Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which is obviously something I've covered on this podcast before, but I forget what floor it is, but there is a certain floor where you can find a crashed Spelljammer that was crewed up by it was captained, I should say, by this Illithid guy wearing like a pirate outfit, and there was a whole opera segment in it, and it's really, really goofy, but really fun and interesting, and also just a kind of great way to show, Spelljammer it's kind of a setting where anything can happen. It's a lot like Planescape in that sense, where you're in this very ethereal, sort of strange location, and the cosmos itself is kind of keeping you at its mercy, and you see all sorts of things that you probably would have never seen anywhere on a material plane or even an elemental plane or anything like that. It's just all astral plane nonsense, and I love it. So you don't age on the astral plane. Another important fact there. So, I mean, technically, I guess you do age, but very, very slowly, like really slowly. And that would be really great for a Spelljammer campaign in general, because you can technically keep it going as long as your party survives. Which, could be saying a lot, depending on what you're throwing at it. And what kind of things could we throw at somebody in the astral plane? Well, obviously, I don't want to go too deep into what our actual monster of the week is, but I will say we do have some very interesting people out there. For one, the astral elves. These are the space elves, pretty much. That's pretty much the best way to describe it. They're like pale skin. They got super awesome clothing. When I look at the clothing for astral elves and the armor they wear, I can't help but feel like it looks sci-fi, right? But it's like sci-fi fantasy. And I had a friend who played Destiny 2, and I feel like there are some connections or similarities between how the astral elf armor from 5e and some of the Destiny armors look. That was just a sort of an offhanded comment I was kind of thinking of. What else can you find? Well, plasmoids. These are people made out of plasma. And obviously you can probably tell they're gooey types of people. I have a couple plasmoid characters in my home Planescape game, and they have some really interesting abilities, one of them being a pseudopod, where you can basically have like a little extra slime limb or like a little extra slime dude helping you out. I think that's really cool. Another very important sort of representation of the population here in the astral plane would be the giant space hamsters. Now, these are exactly what they say on the tin. They are giant hamsters, and they exist in space, in the astral plane. And we know about their existence through Minsk, of Baldur's Gate fame. Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 primarily, but obviously he's in Baldur's Gate 3 too. But he has a companion with him named Boo, who happens to be a miniature giant space hamster. So it's just a normal sized hamster, but of course we wouldn't know that it's actually from Spelljammer, and it is a miniature giant space hamster with much higher intelligence than your average hamster. I just think that's adorable, personally. I kind of a spoiler here, but our monster of the week is going to be the Nyogi. We will get to them later, but they are like little spider dudes who love slavery. That's kind of their whole thing. Their entire society is based around it. We'll get into them more, but they're also fun because they have spelljammers that are just giant spiders. And then lastly, are I think really two of the more important inhabitants when it comes to the astral plane. And I mean, I feel like everybody knows that these people are all over the astral plane. The Illithid and the Githyanki and the Githzerai. There is difference between those two, but yes, the Gith and the Illithid just are all over the astral plane. I mean, that's pretty much kind of their bread and butter, at least the Githyanki, or the Githzerai, the Gith, just the Gith in general. You can find them more often than not, I'd say, in the astral plane doing their thing. And of course, we saw a lot of that lore also represented in Baldur's Gate 3, where one of the main characters is Githyanki, which is a really bold choice for a Dungeons and Dragons game, considering before Baldur's Gate 3, I would honestly say Githyanki is probably not many people's top race. I know there are plenty of people, Spelljammer and Planescape fans, who definitely had Githyanki up there, but for your average Dungeons and Dragons enjoyer whose average campaign takes place around Faerun or whatever, they don't probably give too much of a crap about Githyanki until Baldur's Gate came along and we got all this cool lore, which obviously all existed already, but they did such a good way of presenting the Queen Gith and all that stuff that we actually have interest in the Gith race within the Dungeons and Dragons fandom. And I'd say now, even compared to some of the other races, Githyanki are starting to become a bit more, I guess, recognized because of their role in that game. So that's just a quick shout out to Baldur's Gate 3 for having such cool Spelljammer and astral plane lore all over the place. Like, really, the two main slices of lore you get in Baldur's Gate 3 are, of course, all the Faerun stuff and the Reckoning and the Dead 3, obviously super huge to the Baldur's Gate trilogy as a whole. But then we also have all this really interesting, just out of nowhere, Spelljammer and astral plane lore that I think really does kind of take it to the next level, because it goes to show how deep the actual setting you're in is. So, in other terms, Spelljammer, to me, represents the slice of D&D where creativity reigns. Ultimately, when you're doing a Spelljammer campaign, you can really kind of take a step back and do really a lot of what you want when it comes to setting things up for your characters, because the astral plane doesn't necessarily have a set code of rules you can go and read. Ultimately, it is a very strange place that changes constantly and can even change depending on who's even present at the time. I've had situations where, maybe a player will be thinking about a past event or something, and maybe like a single item from that past event might float by casually in the astral plane and then vanish off into the ether. just because that's how the plane kind of works. It plays off of your thoughts and your emotions and your feelings, and the best of us can use that to pilot a ship, but others are going to find themselves very lost amongst all of the emotions and chaos of the astral plane. And that is why it is such a crazy, interesting place to me. So now we're going to get into our monster of the week. I already mentioned who they are, but I didn't exactly talk a little bit about what they are. The Nyogi. Who the hell are the Nyogi? Well, the Nyogi are child-sized spider people. So I'd say maybe 2 to 3 feet in height, that their entire society, I'm not kidding you, their entire society is based upon slavery. They cannot physically understand not owning other people, or they're sort of, within their society, everything is related to who owns who's on top, very much sort of a hierarchical system where everyone has a very set position within their society. In fact, Nyogi oftentimes paint themselves with different patterns and colors to represent their position within the hierarchy. So whenever you're fighting a Nyogi sort of hive, you're going to probably be fighting, oh, this Nyogi's red with polka dots, or this Nyogi's yellow with stripes. And in each of those will sort of differentiate what the role is within Nyogi society. So what makes Nyogis kind of scary, at least for low-level parties, is that they have an ability that they can do every short rest or long rest. And that is basically they have a mind control ability. It's a charm, but it's a very powerful one. If you fail, I think it's a wisdom save against their DC, you basically are made to do whatever the Nyogi wants until you take damage or somebody wakes you up out of it. But, the fact that recharges every short rest is, for me, super dangerous, because that means the Nyogi can continue that sort of control over and over again, which would also, not saying anything, but I am saying things, it would make the Nyogi very good enemies, because you're not just going to be fighting the Nyogi. You're also going to be fighting whoever they've happened to enslave at the time and whoever they might be controlling. Now, obviously, like I said, if they take some damage, then maybe the person they're controlling might have like a save or two. But I feel like, at a certain point, you could say, maybe the Nyogis had control of them long enough to where it's a lot harder for them to break free of that grasp if you wanted them to stay on the bad side a little longer. Or very well, you could have it so that damage does break that effect, and then you sort of start a kind of slave revolution within this sort of Nyogi whatever society. I've had a mission in the past where a Nyogi faction have taken over a Githzerai monastery. And I find it really interesting how sort of we kind of been able to weave a lot of the sort of Githzerai stuff and all that business into, all this. Also, I know I think I mentioned it earlier, but Nyogi Spelljammers are just so cool looking. They're just giant spiders. If you really, honestly, for just a fun exercise, if you want, just go and look up different Spelljammers online and see all of the different crazy designs that all these different races and factions have for their Spelljammers. And even some of the custom designs people have out there are crazy. I'm really stoked on spelljamming in general, just because there's just so much creativity there. But getting back to the Nyogi, we saw the Nyogi return in 5e, The Light of Xeraxis, but I don't think they really had a lot of coverage up until that point. We know about the Nyogi. We've known about the Nyogi for a while, but first time we've seen them in a fat minute is Light of Xeraxis, which there's a lot to say about that campaign in general. I've never personally ran it. I've heard things about Light of Xeraxis, but I can say it did give us some of the cooler races to play. All right, like Plasmoid, Gif. I'm on board personally. I love myself a Gif. Just the hippo dudes, they're so funny. But Yeah, if you're going to be using Niyogi in a Spelljammer campaign, they can fit in most probably around sort of the start of a campaign. They might be really good for sort of inciting incident. But I think as you get later on in the campaign, you're gonna like your players are like level 10 or something. They're gonna find that they can take on a Niyogi slave ship pretty easy. So that's Niyogi. I definitely look up a picture of the guys. They're freaky looking as heck, but really honestly just a very cool enemy you can come across in Spelljammer. You don't really see them a ton else, a ton of other places. I think they fit most in the astral plane. So that'll be it for us this week. Please join us next week where we talk about single player mode from Cyberpunk Red. I'm really looking forward to that one. And of course, this has been Dungeons and Dystopias. Thank you so much for listening. Please come back next week. Goodbye.